Chapter 1. The First Glance. The morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of Harper and Company, a successful marketing firm nestled in the heart of the city. The atmosphere inside was sharp and polished, matching the pristine surroundings. Harper Lawson, the young founder and CEO, sat behind her desk, her attention divided between the reports spread out in front of her and the looming interview ahead. Her gaze was calm, but there was a faint trace of impatience as she glanced at the clock on the wall. Today was like any other, a continuous flow of business meetings, decisions, and management. But today there was something else. There was the upcoming interview. She had read countless resumes, scrolled through an endless array of applications, but something about this one candidate, Luke Hayes, stood out. Maybe it was his diverse experience, or the way his career had jumped from job to job without a clear pattern. Something unpolished, unexpected. A challenge, perhaps. Luke arrived at the building earlier than expected. He stood outside for a moment, staring at the towering structure before taking a deep breath. He wasn't nervous. He'd been through too much to be fazed by an interview, but there was a sense of anticipation. An unfamiliar feeling of significance clung to the air. The revolving glass doors opened before him, and he entered with a steady pace. As he was escorted up to Harper's office, the noise of the city faded into the quiet hum of the company's corridors. The sound of his footsteps fell softly on the carpeted floor, and with each step, the world outside seemed to slip away. When the assistant led him to the large double doors of Harper's office, he felt a strange mix of calm and awareness. An awareness that the next few minutes might be more important than he had originally thought. Harper looked up as the doors opened, her sharp eyes immediately falling on the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Luke as he entered. He had an air of quiet confidence, the kind that seemed to carry years of experience and endurance. He wasn't the type to try to impress anyone. He was simply there, present and focused. Luke felt her eyes on him as he walked across the room, and though his expression remained composed, something stirred within him. It wasn't nerves, but rather the silent, electric charge that sparked between them the moment their eyes met. For a brief second, time seemed to slow, as though the world had paused around them. He took his seat opposite Harper, and for a moment, neither moved. Their gazes held, a brief, unspoken exchange that felt far more significant than the interview they were about to conduct. Harper's fingers brushed the edge of the file before her, her mind already processing, but there was a new layer of thought beneath her composed exterior. Something she didn't understand, something unfamiliar. Luke's hands rested casually on his lap, his attention fully on her. He noticed the way she carried herself, her every movement measured and precise. Yet there was something beneath that surface control, an intensity that matched his own. Though they hadn't spoken a single word, they had communicated everything in that first look. The interview began in the usual fashion. Resumes, qualifications, experience. Harper reviewed his background while Luke sat, the tension in the air slowly fading into something more subtle, more delicate. The questions were straightforward, professional, but each response felt layered with more than just words. Neither of them acknowledged it, but they both knew. There was something happening here, something unspoken that pulled them closer. As Harper moved on to the next set of notes, her thoughts drifted away from his qualifications. There was more to this man than what could be written on paper, something that intrigued her. A man of depth, of untold stories. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel it. His presence was enough. Luke, on the other hand, found himself watching her movements, the way she carried her authority without arrogance, the way she analyzed every detail with precision. She was unlike anyone he had met before, and that fact alone sparked something deep within him. He had come here for a job, but now, he wasn't so sure that was the only reason. The interview ended, but the connection remained. As Luke rose from his seat, Harper stood, extending her hand to him, a professional gesture. Their hands met, and again, there was that unexplainable spark. Neither flinched, but both felt it. A fleeting moment that left an impression far stronger than any words ever could. He left the office without looking back, but he could still feel her gaze on him as he walked away. Harper remained at her desk, her eyes lingering on the door for a moment longer than necessary. The first glance had been enough to change everything. As the door closed behind Luke, both of them knew that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. A tension in the air. The week after the interview, Harper sat at her desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. Luke's resume was there, neatly placed on top. She had already made up her mind, but the weight of the decision lingered in her thoughts. There was a certain tension that had settled over the office, an invisible thread that connected her to that brief meeting days ago. The city outside buzzed with the usual chaos. Honking cars, hurried footsteps, distant chatter. But inside Harper's office, everything was still, almost too still. She shifted in her seat, her mind replaying the silent exchange between her and Luke. Something about him had left an imprint on her, a quiet intensity that tugged at her thoughts. She couldn't shake it, and yet, she couldn't fully grasp it either. Her fingers brushed over his resume once more, eyes scanning the lines she had already memorized. His qualifications were solid, his experience varied, but none of that explained the pull she felt, the unspoken connection that had hung in the air during that interview. It had been more than just a professional meeting, and that unsettled her. She didn't like being unsettled. She set the papers aside and rose from her chair, crossing the room to the large windows that framed the bustling city. Her mind wandered as she gazed out at the view, her hands resting lightly on the glass. There was a kind of calm she sought from moments like this, a retreat into herself, where she could make sense of the thoughts swirling in her head. Luke, meanwhile, moved through the city streets with purpose. His mind was preoccupied, but not with the usual concerns of life or work. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to the interview, to the woman who had captivated him without saying a word. Harper. He hadn't expected her to leave such an impression, yet here he was, walking through a crowded street, thinking of her. The offer had come swiftly, a job that he was more than qualified for. But that wasn't what lingered in his mind. It was her, the way she had looked at him, the way her presence filled the room without effort. It had been so subtle, yet so powerful. He had never encountered anything like it before. Something about her had disrupted the usual flow of his life, and now he was caught in the current. He walked into the building once more, the same path he had taken for the interview, but this time, everything felt different. The air felt charged, heavier with anticipation. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way through the halls. This wasn't just the start of a new job. It was the beginning of something far more significant, though he couldn't quite name it. Upstairs, Harper had returned to her desk, the tension in her shoulders growing tighter with every passing second. She was someone who always had control of her surroundings, her company, her emotions. But now, something about this situation with Luke made her feel as though she was losing her grip. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. When the knock on her office door finally came, she didn't flinch, though her heart quickened slightly. She straightened, composing herself, preparing for the moment she knew had been building since the interview. Luke entered, his presence as steady as before, but there was something different now. It wasn't just the prospect of a new job. It was the awareness that both of them carried, that quiet, electric tension that filled the space between them. He stood before her, and for a long moment, they simply observed one another. The papers were signed, the formalities taken care of, but that wasn't what either of them focused on. The air between them was thick with the unspoken, and neither one could break it. Harper felt it in her chest, a tightness that she couldn't explain. Luke could feel it too, a silent draw that pulled him closer, though neither of them moved. As Harper handed him the documents, their fingers brushed again, just as they had during the interview. That same spark, that same flash of something deeper, passed between them. They both paused, frozen in that fleeting moment, feeling the weight of it settle into their bones. Harper quickly withdrew her hand, her expression carefully neutral, but Luke noticed the slight hesitation in her movements. She was trying to maintain control, but the connection between them was undeniable. It hung in the air like a thread, waiting to be pulled taut. He left the office with his new role secured, but more than that, with the knowledge that this was far from over. As he walked through the halls, the echo of his footsteps was drowned out by the steady beat of his heart, the tension in his chest mirroring what he had felt in Harper's presence. Harper remained in her office, the door closed behind him, but the tension lingered. She stared at the empty chair where Luke had just sat, her thoughts racing faster than she could keep up with. She wasn't one to let distractions take over. But this was different. This was something she couldn't easily push aside. The day ended, the office lights dimmed, and the city outside continued its relentless pace. But inside Harper's office, the air remained thick with the tension that had filled the room since Luke's arrival. Both of them had felt it, both of them had acknowledged it in their own way, and now, it was only a matter of time before that tension came to a head. For now, though, they remained in their separate worlds, silently aware of the pull between them, neither one able to fully grasp where it would lead. But the tension was undeniable, and it was only growing stronger. Chapter 3: Unspoken Connections. The days turned into weeks, and Luke settled into his new role at Harper and Company. The job came easily to him, his tasks blending into the steady rhythm of the company's routine. But there was something else woven into the fabric of his days, something that lingered in every corner of the office, something that followed him like a shadow. Harper. Their interactions had remained strictly professional, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Each meeting, each brief exchange of glances, carried more weight than any words ever could. Neither of them had acknowledged it out loud, but they both knew. Something was shifting, growing, between them. Luke moved through his work with precision, but his thoughts often drifted to Harper. He found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way she carried herself with effortless grace and authority. There was a magnetism about her, a quiet intensity that drew him in. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably striking. It was something deeper, something that spoke to him on a level he couldn't fully explain. Harper, too, was aware of the connection that had been building since the interview. She had tried to push it aside, tried to focus on her work, but every time she saw Luke, it resurfaced. It wasn't something she could control, and that unnerved her. She had built her company from the ground up, mastered every challenge thrown her way. But this was different. In the quiet moments between meetings, Harper found her mind wandering back to Luke. She would catch glimpses of him around the office, walking through the halls, seated at his desk, deep in thought. Each time, a familiar tension stirred within her, a pull that she couldn't resist. She had always prided herself on being in control, but this feeling was beyond her reach. Their paths crossed often, as though the universe itself was pushing them closer. It was never anything overt, just brief moments. A passing glance in the hallway, a shared silence in the elevator, a flicker of eye contact across the room during meetings. But each time, that connection deepened, growing stronger with every unspoken exchange. One afternoon, as Luke was working late, he found himself alone in the office. The usual hustle and bustle had quieted, leaving only the soft hum of the building's systems in the background. The city outside was beginning to wind down, the sun casting a warm, golden hue across the skyline. He looked out of the window, taking in the view, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Harper was still in her office. He knew that. She often worked late, and tonight was no exception. Her office door was closed, but even behind the glass walls, he could sense her presence. There was something about the stillness of the evening, the quiet that hung in the air, that made the connection between them feel more tangible than ever. Harper, too, was aware of Luke's presence. She sat at her desk, the reports in front of her forgotten, as her thoughts drifted to him once again. She could feel the weight of the unspoken connection pressing down on her, heavier than before. The tension between them was palpable, and yet neither of them had made a move to acknowledge it. It hung there, just out of reach, like a storm waiting to break. The clock ticked on, but neither of them left. There was an unspoken reason they both remained behind, lingering in the quiet of the empty office. Harper stood and moved to the window, her gaze drifting over the city below. She didn't need to look behind her to know that Luke was still there. She could feel him, just as she had felt him every day since he started working there. Luke, seated at his desk, was fully aware of Harper's presence. He could sense her, even though the office was large and the distance between them vast. There was something about the way the evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, that made the connection between them feel almost tangible. As though, in the stillness of the office, everything else had fallen away, leaving only the two of them. Hours passed like this, each of them working in silence, yet fully conscious of the other. It was a strange kind of tension, one that neither of them had ever experienced before. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was undeniable, as though the air between them was charged, waiting for something to happen, for one of them to make the first move. But the night wore on, and neither did. When Harper finally rose from her chair and began gathering her things, Luke did the same. Their movements mirrored one another, though they remained separated by walls, by the unspoken barrier that neither of them had dared to cross. As Harper left her office, she glanced briefly toward Luke's desk. He had already stood and was heading toward the elevator, his expression focused, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. Harper felt it, too, a pull, a tension that was more than just professional. They met at the elevator, standing side by side in silence as they waited for the doors to open. The air between them crackled with the unspoken connection, a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Neither looked directly at the other, but they both felt it. The weight of the moment, the quiet understanding that something had shifted. The elevator doors slid open, and they stepped inside, the silence between them stretching on. The ride down was brief, but every second felt charged with the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. When the doors opened again, they parted ways without a word, each lost in their own thoughts, but both fully aware that this was far from over. As they walked out into the night, the connection between them remained, stronger than ever. They hadn't spoken a single word, but everything had changed. The tension that had lingered in the air was no longer a distant hum. It was a living, breathing thing, and neither of them could deny it. Something was happening, something neither of them could control. And as they disappeared into the night, both Luke and Harper knew that this unspoken connection was only the beginning. Chapter 4. A stirring of emotions. Another week passed, and the steady rhythm of work consumed Harper's and Luke's days. But beneath the surface of the routine, the tension between them continued to grow. It lingered in every shared glance, every moment of silence that passed between them, like an invisible thread that pulled them closer with each passing day. Neither had spoken of it, but they both felt it, an undeniable force that neither could escape. For Harper, it was unsettling. She had always been in control of her emotions, her surroundings, her career. She had built everything on the foundation of discipline and focus, never allowing herself to get swept away by personal feelings. But Luke's presence had changed that. He had stirred something within her that she had tried to suppress, and now it was impossible to ignore. As she sat at her desk, reviewing a new proposal, her mind wandered back to him. It wasn't just his appearance or his professionalism that occupied her thoughts. It was the way he seemed to mirror her in so many ways. Quiet, focused, determined. Yet, there was an intensity about him, a quiet energy that drew her in. She couldn't quite define what it was, but it had taken root in her thoughts and refused to let go. Luke, on the other hand, found himself thinking of Harper more often than he cared to admit. Every time he entered the office, he felt her presence before he saw her. There was something magnetic about her, something that had caught him off guard from the moment they first met. He had worked with many powerful women before, but none had affected him the way Harper did. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his thoughts would drift back to her. The way her eyes seemed to hold a depth he couldn't fully understand, the quiet elegance with which she moved, the way she could command a room without saying a word. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something more profound. One afternoon, the two of them found themselves alone in a conference room, reviewing documents for an upcoming project. The room was bathed in soft, golden light from the afternoon sun, and the air was still, almost thick with the unspoken tension that had been building between them. Harper sat at the head of the table, her posture straight and composed, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. Luke sat across from her, his gaze occasionally drifting toward her as he pretended to focus on his work. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was charged with something neither of them could name. Harper felt it in the way her heart beat just a little faster when she caught a glimpse of Luke out of the corner of her eye. Luke felt it in the way the room seemed smaller, as though the space between them was shrinking, even though they hadn't moved. As they worked, Harper's hand brushed against the edge of the table, and for a brief moment, her eyes flicked up to meet Luke's. Their gazes locked, and in that instant, the air between them seemed to thicken even more. It was as if time had slowed, and for a heartbeat, nothing else existed but the connection they shared. Harper quickly returned her attention to the documents, her heart racing, though she showed no outward sign of it. She wasn't used to feeling this way. So out of control, so affected by someone else's presence. It unnerved her, but at the same time, there was a part of her that didn't want to push it away. She wasn't sure why, but she knew that this was different. This was more than just a fleeting attraction. Luke, too, was affected by the moment. His chest tightened, and he found it difficult to focus on the words in front of him. The quiet connection between them had grown into something palpable, something that seemed to fill the entire room. He had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, but with Harper, it was becoming increasingly difficult. He couldn't ignore what he felt, even though it made no sense. The hours passed, and eventually, the work was done. Harper gathered her papers, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to buy herself time to regain her composure. Luke did the same, though his thoughts were far from the task at hand. As they stood, preparing to leave the room, their eyes met once again. This time, neither of them looked away. The moment stretched on, filled with an intensity that neither of them could deny. It was as though the entire room had shrunk, and there was nothing left but the two of them, standing on opposite sides of the table, the space between them charged with an unspoken energy. Harper's heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure, refusing to let her emotions show. She didn't understand what was happening between them, but she knew that whatever it was powerful. More powerful than anything she had ever experienced. Luke felt it too. He could see the same tension reflected in Harper's eyes, the same pull that had been growing stronger with each passing day. He wanted to move closer, to close the distance between them, but something held him back. It wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that once they crossed that line, there would be no going back. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of them speaking, neither of them moving, until finally, Harper broke the moment. She nodded slightly, signaling the end of the meeting, and turned to leave the room. Luke followed, his mind racing, his heart still pounding in his chest. As they walked back to their respective offices, the tension between them lingered, hanging in the air like an unfinished conversation. They had come so close to acknowledging what was happening between them, but in the end, they had both chosen to step back, to retreat into the safety of their professional roles. But even as they tried to return to their normal routines, both Harper and Luke knew that the connection between them was only growing stronger. It was no longer something they could ignore. It was there, waiting for the right moment to surface, and when it did, it would change everything. For now, they would continue with their work, pretending that nothing had changed. But deep down, they both knew the truth. Their emotions, their connection, had already started to shift the balance, and soon, neither of them would be able to deny it any longer. Chapter 5. Unseen Currents. The days that followed were marked by a subtle shift in the office atmosphere, though no one else seemed to notice. For Harper and Luke, however, the change was undeniable. The connection between them, once simmering beneath the surface, had grown into something more tangible. It was no longer just a passing glance or a shared moment of silence. It was something deeper, something that was beginning to affect them both in ways they hadn't expected. Harper had always prided herself on her ability to maintain a clear separation between her personal and professional lives. She had worked hard to build her company, focusing on her goals with unwavering determination. But now, every time she walked into the office, she felt a subtle pull toward Luke. It was as if the very air between them had become charged, and she couldn't ignore the way her heart quickened whenever she saw him. She tried to push it aside, bury herself in work, and focus on the endless stream of meetings, projects, and deadlines that filled her days. But no matter how much she tried, Luke was always there, an unspoken presence that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. He had become an integral part of her daily routine, and she couldn't help but feel drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Luke, too, was struggling with the growing intensity of his feelings for Harper. At first, he had tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than a passing attraction, something that would fade with time. But as the days turned into weeks, the connection between them only grew stronger. He found himself thinking about her more and more, not just at work, but during the quiet moments of his day. He would catch himself replaying their brief encounters in his mind. The way her eyes seemed to linger on him just a little longer than necessary, the subtle shifts in her expression that betrayed her otherwise composed exterior. One Friday afternoon, as the week drew to a close, Harper found herself sitting at her desk, staring at the spreadsheets in front of her without really seeing them. The numbers blurred together, and her mind wandered back to the moments she had shared with Luke over the past few days. There had been nothing overt, no grand gestures or declarations of feeling, but the tension between them had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the large window that overlooked the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the office. The light filtered through the blinds, creating soft patterns of shadow on the floor. The office was unusually quiet, with most of the employees having already left for the weekend. But Luke was still there. She could feel it, even without looking. He was working late, as he often did, seated at his desk in the corner of the open-plan office. Harper hadn't seen him in a few hours, but she knew he was still there, just as she knew that their paths would cross again before the evening was over. It had become a sort of unspoken routine, both of them staying late, working in silence, yet fully aware of the other's presence. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Harper rose from her chair and walked to the window. She stood there for a long moment, her thoughts swirling, her emotions a tangled mess of confusion and desire. She had always been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to control her feelings. But now, she felt as though she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and it both excited and terrified her. Luke, meanwhile, was seated at his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, though his mind was elsewhere. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of the building's air conditioning system and the soft click of his fingers on the keyboard. But beneath the surface, his thoughts were a whirlwind of emotion. He could sense Harper's presence in her office, just as he always could. It was as though the space between them had become a living thing, pulsing with an energy that neither of them could fully understand. The minutes ticked by, and eventually, Luke rose from his chair. He gathered his things, preparing to leave for the weekend, but something held him back. He glanced toward Harper's office, the door still closed, the lights on inside. He knew she was still there, just as she knew he hadn't left. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a quiet agreement to linger, to stay in each other's orbit for just a little longer. Without thinking, Luke walked toward the window at the far end of the office, the one that overlooked the same cityscape Harper had been gazing at moments earlier. He stood there, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge the feelings he had been trying so hard to suppress. He was falling for her. There was no other way to explain it. Every glance, every shared moment, every silent exchange had built up to this. He had tried to fight it, to push it aside. But now, standing here in the quiet of the office, he could no longer deny the truth. Harper, still standing at her own window, felt the same pull. She didn't turn around, didn't need to. She knew that Luke was standing at the other end of the office, looking out at the same view. The connection between them had grown into something undeniable, something that could no longer be ignored. The air in the office felt heavy with unspoken emotion, a quiet tension that pressed down on both of them. For the first time in a long while, Harper didn't feel in control. She didn't know what would happen next, and that scared her. But at the same time, there was a part of her that was ready to let go, to surrender to whatever this was. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the office into a soft twilight. Harper turned away from the window and walked slowly back to her desk. She sat down, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening between her and Luke, it was no longer something she could ignore. Luke, too, turned away from the window, his decision made. The connection between them had reached a point where it was impossible to pretend it wasn't there. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't continue to fight the feelings that had been building inside him. As they both gathered their things and prepared to leave for the weekend, the unspoken connection between them remained, stronger than ever. Neither of them had said a word, but everything had changed. They both knew that the next time they saw each other, the boundaries that had once kept them apart would no longer exist. And as they left the office, stepping out into the cool evening air, they both knew that whatever came next, it would be unlike anything they had ever experienced before. Chapter 6. A weekend of reflection. The weekend stretched out before them like a quiet expanse, offering time for reflection. Yet neither Harper nor Luke could escape the thoughts that consumed their minds. The feelings that had swirled in the office had followed them home, lingering like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Harper spent her Saturday morning sitting at the dining table in her apartment, her laptop open, but her fingers unmoving. She usually worked during the weekends, finishing reports, planning meetings, catching up on tasks she didn't have time for during the week. But today, her focus was fractured. The thoughts of Luke kept creeping into her mind, displacing any attempt at productivity. Outside her window, the city bustled with life. Cars passed below, people wandered the streets, shops opened their doors for business. The world continued its rhythm, but Harper felt as though she were standing still. The stillness pressed down on her, and no amount of work could distract her from the growing realization that Luke had become more than just an employee. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as she tried to shake the thoughts away. But they persisted. She couldn't help but remember the moments they had shared in the office, the subtle glances, the tension that had built between them, unspoken but undeniable. Her mind replayed those moments in a loop, as if searching for an answer, a solution to the growing complexity of her emotions. For Luke, the weekend felt just as heavy. He had planned to spend Saturday morning running errands, catching up on personal tasks, and perhaps going for a long walk through the park to clear his head. But as soon as he left his apartment, he realized that no amount of fresh air or busy work could quiet the storm of feelings inside him. He wandered through the park anyway, his footsteps slow and aimless. The sky was overcast, a soft gray that matched his mood. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and people walked their dogs or jogged along the paths. Luke barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere, stuck on Harper and the overwhelming pull he felt toward her. He tried to make sense of it. He had worked for her for only a short time, yet the connection between them felt like it had been building for years. How had it grown so strong, so quickly? It was as if they had skipped the usual steps of getting to know one another and had been thrown into something much deeper. As he walked, his thoughts shifted from confusion to acceptance. Whatever was happening between them wasn't something he could easily explain, but it was something he could no longer ignore. The feelings were real, undeniable, and they had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Meanwhile, Harper's mind was racing as she sat in the quiet of her apartment. She had never allowed herself to get close to anyone at work, let alone someone who worked directly for her. It was a rule she had made for herself, a boundary she had always respected. But now, that boundary was blurring, and she couldn't control the feelings that had taken root. She closed her laptop and stood up, walking to the large window in her living room. She stared out at the skyline, the tall buildings standing like sentinels against the gray sky. The view usually calmed her, grounding her in the reality of her success, reminding her of how far she had come. But today, it offered no comfort. Instead, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear. She knew that when Monday came, things would be different. She didn't know how, but she sensed that the next time she saw Luke, something would shift between them. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something vast, something neither of them could predict or control. Luke spent the rest of the afternoon in a similar state of restless anticipation. He returned to his apartment, tried to focus on reading a book or watching television, but his thoughts drifted back to Harper every few minutes. The tension that had built between them was no longer just a passing attraction. It had become something much more complicated, something that needed to be addressed. He sat on his couch, the book lying open on his lap, but he couldn't focus on the words. The quiet of the room felt oppressive, and he longed for some sort of resolution, though he didn't know what that would look like. He thought about going for another walk, but instead, he remained still, staring at the walls as his mind churned. Harper, too, felt trapped by her thoughts. The usual distractions she relied on, work, exercise, even a good book, were powerless to pull her away from the growing realization that she was falling for Luke. It was a feeling she hadn't expected, a feeling that terrified her, but it was also thrilling in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the evening wore on, Harper tried to relax, pouring herself a glass of wine and sitting on the couch with a book, but her eyes skimmed the pages without absorbing the words. Her thoughts remained locked on Luke, on the way his presence filled the office, on the quiet intensity of his gaze when their eyes met. The night deepened, and eventually, Harper set the book aside, her mind too full to concentrate. She walked to her bedroom, the weight of the day pressing down on her. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her thoughts continued to swirl, a mix of confusion, desire, and uncertainty. Luke, too, found sleep elusive. He lay in bed, the faint sounds of the city drifting through the open window, but his mind was too busy to rest. He replayed their interactions over and over, searching for some clue as to what would happen next. Sunday came and went in much the same way, with both of them caught in a state of limbo. Harper went through the motions of her day, running errands, catching up on work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. Luke spent Sunday in quiet reflection, alternating between moments of clarity and doubt. He knew that whatever was happening between him and Harper was something neither of them could ignore any longer. The tension had reached its breaking point, and by the time Monday arrived, he knew they would both have to face whatever came next. As the weekend drew to a close, both Harper and Luke found themselves standing on the edge of an uncertain future. The feelings that had been building between them were no longer something they could push aside. Whatever happened next, they both knew it would change everything. Chapter 7. The Shift. Monday arrived with the cool, crisp air of early autumn. The leaves had begun to change, adding a vibrant splash of color to the cityscape. Harper sat at her desk, staring out of the window, watching the wind gently shake the branches of the trees below. She had arrived at the office early, hoping to ground herself before the day began. But the quiet moments only left more room for her thoughts to wander. Luke would be here soon. The realization settled in her chest like a weight. For the last 2 days, his presence had haunted her thoughts, growing more vivid with each passing hour. She had tried to rationalize her feelings, to compartmentalize her emotions as she had always done. But something about Luke broke through those walls she had so carefully built. Her office was a sanctuary of order, a place where she had always maintained control. The bookshelves were neatly arranged, the desk free of clutter, the papers stacked in precise piles. It was the one space in her life where she felt completely in control, until now. Today, the office felt charged with an undercurrent of anticipation, as though something unspoken hung in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. Harper glanced at the clock. Any moment now, Luke would arrive, and she couldn't predict how she would feel when she saw him again. She ran a hand through her hair, smoothing it down, trying to steady herself. Outside her office door, she heard the faint sounds of the staff arriving for the day, footsteps, the hum of voices, the clatter of keyboards starting up. It was the rhythm of the workday, a rhythm she had known for years, but today it felt foreign to her, as though everything was just slightly off balance. Luke, too, had arrived early. He stood in the elevator, watching the numbers tick down as the floors passed by. His heart thudded in his chest with a steady, nervous beat. All weekend, his thoughts had been consumed by Harper, and now, as he approached the office, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. The elevator doors slid open, and Luke stepped into the hallway, feeling a chill run down his spine. The office was quiet in the early morning light, the desks mostly empty, the phone silent. He made his way to his workspace, his footsteps muffled by the carpet, but his thoughts raced with anticipation. He knew today would be different. The invisible line that had been drawn between them, separating boss from employee, had already blurred. He could feel it, like a pull in the air, urging them closer together. There was no going back now. Luke sat down at his desk, trying to focus on the tasks in front of him. His computer screen glowed with emails, schedules, and reports, but his mind refused to engage. He glanced toward Harper's office door, closed as usual, the frosted glass obscuring the view inside. He wondered if she was thinking about him as much as he had been thinking about her. The hours passed in a haze of half-hearted work. Harper moved through meetings, answered emails, and signed documents, but her focus was fractured. Every time she glanced up from her desk, she half expected to see Luke standing there, though he never did. Their paths didn't cross throughout the morning, but the tension between them seemed to hum in the background, like a low frequency that only they could hear. As the afternoon wore on, Harper found herself unable to concentrate. The feelings that had simmered beneath the surface all weekend were now boiling over, demanding attention. She stood up from her desk, walking to the window once again, staring out at the city. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that mirrored the weight in her chest. She needed clarity, but it felt as though her thoughts were tangled in knots, impossible to unravel. Meanwhile, Luke was fighting his own battle with distraction. He had tried to keep his head down, focusing on the tasks in front of him, but Harper was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. It was as if her presence filled the entire office, even when she wasn't in the room. The tension had grown unbearable, and he knew that something had to give. By late afternoon, the office had settled into a quiet lull. Most of the staff had left for the day, leaving behind the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Luke sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, but the words blurred together, unreadable. He knew that Harper was still in her office, and the thought of her just a few doors down gnawed at him. Harper, too, felt the pull growing stronger. She paced her office, restless, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions she couldn't seem to sort out. She wanted to talk to Luke, to clear the air, but she didn't know how. She had never been in a situation like this before, where the lines of her professional life and personal life had blurred so completely. The minutes ticked by, and finally, Harper made a decision. She couldn't avoid this any longer. With a deep breath, she gathered her things, preparing to leave for the day. But as she walked toward the door, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her mind racing. Should she talk to him now? Should she wait until tomorrow? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she knew that if she didn't face this now, it would only become more complicated. Luke sensed that the day was winding down, but the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had grown thicker, almost palpable. He stood up from his desk, gathering his jacket and briefcase, preparing to leave. But as he moved toward the exit, he paused, his eyes drawn to Harper's office door once again. He could feel that something was about to happen, something that would shift everything between them. The office was almost entirely empty now, the lights dimmed, the phone silent. Luke stood in the hallway, staring at Harper's door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he knew that the moment was fast approaching. Inside her office, Harper stood frozen by the door. Her pulse raced as she debated whether to open it and face whatever was waiting on the other side. She had always prided herself on being decisive, on knowing exactly what she wanted and going after it. But now, she was paralyzed by the weight of the decision in front of her. Finally, with a deep breath, Harper opened the door. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes immediately locking onto Luke, who stood just a few feet away. The world seemed to slow as they looked at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words and emotions. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension that had been building between them for days, weeks, now hung in the air like a thick cloud, ready to burst. Luke took a slow, measured step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Harper's heart raced, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Everything she had felt, every emotion she had buried, every thought she had pushed away, rose to the surface, overwhelming her. The moment stretched on, both of them standing on the precipice of something they couldn't yet name. The office around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, caught in the pull of something neither of them could resist any longer. Whatever came next, they both knew, would change everything. Chapter 8. A Step Closer. The morning sun poured through the large glass windows of Harper's office, casting a soft, golden glow over the neatly arranged space. Harper sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the numbers and charts on the screen in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. She had replayed the moment in the hallway with Luke over and over in her head, and no matter how hard she tried to push it away, it lingered. The silence of her office, usually a source of focus and control, now felt oppressive. She knew she should be diving into her work, getting ahead of the countless tasks awaiting her attention, but her thoughts were completely consumed by Luke. That brief, charged encounter had unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. The intensity of his gaze, the electricity in the air between them. It was as if something unspoken had passed between them in that moment, something that couldn't be ignored. Harper sighed, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her temples in an attempt to clear her mind. She had always been so disciplined, so in control of her emotions, but with Luke, that control seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and exhilarating all at once. Luke, on the other hand, was pacing his small apartment, the memory of Harper's eyes on him refusing to leave his mind. He had barely slept the night before, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The connection between them was undeniable, but it left him feeling unmoored, unsure of what came next. He couldn't deny that he was drawn to her. Her strength, her intelligence, the way she seemed to command a room without saying a word. But at the same time, he knew the risks. Harper was his boss, and he was still trying to prove himself in a job he had barely started. Any misstep could derail everything he had worked for. Yet, despite all of this, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening between them was bigger than either of their careers. He stopped pacing and glanced at the clock. It was time to head to work, and he knew today would be different. The unspoken tension between them would only grow stronger. He had no idea how they were supposed to navigate this, but avoiding it seemed impossible. By the time Luke arrived at the office, the usual hum of activity had already begun. The soft chatter of colleagues, the clicking of keyboards, and the ringing of phones created a comforting white noise. But as he made his way to his desk, Luke's focus was entirely on Harper's office. The door was closed, as it often was in the mornings, but the thought of her just on the other side of it made his pulse quicken. He sat down at his desk, trying to settle into the rhythm of the workday, but every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward Harper's door. His heart beat a little faster, and his thoughts wandered back to the hallway, to the moment they had shared. Luke tried to focus on his work, on the stack of reports in front of him, but it was a losing battle. The hours passed slowly. Harper, too, found herself distracted by thoughts of Luke. She had tried to dive into her usual routine, meetings, emails, phone calls, but every task felt like a surface-level distraction from the emotions swirling beneath the surface. The brief moment they had shared lingered in her mind, like a scene from a movie that played over and over again, each time pulling her deeper into the memory. She knew she had to face it, whatever it was. Harper had never been one to avoid difficult situations, and this was no different. She had always believed that clarity came from confronting things head-on, and that's exactly what she intended to do now. By midday, Harper stood up from her desk, her mind made up. She couldn't let this tension between them continue to simmer. Something had to give. Without hesitating, she grabbed a few papers and headed toward Luke's desk, her heart pounding in her chest. Luke saw her coming before she even reached him. His breath caught in his throat as he watched Harper approach, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness settling over him. She moved with her usual confidence, but there was something different in the way she carried herself today, something more intentional, more charged. When Harper reached his desk, she set the papers down, her eyes briefly meeting his before glancing away. She pointed to one of the documents, her body language calm and professional, but Luke could feel the tension in the air. He nodded, taking the papers and scanning the contents, but his mind wasn't on the reports. All he could think about was her presence. The way the space around them seemed to shrink the moment she arrived. Harper stayed for a few moments longer, standing beside him as he reviewed the information. There was a stillness between them, a shared awareness of the unspoken weight of the situation. Luke felt it in the quickening of his pulse, in the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the papers. Harper felt it too, in the way her breath seemed to catch every time their eyes briefly met. After a few minutes, Harper gave a small nod and turned to leave, walking back toward her office. Luke watched her go, his eyes lingering on her retreating figure, feeling the intensity of their connection deepen with every passing second. He knew that something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur. Luke tried to focus on his work, to immerse himself in the tasks at hand, but his thoughts were entirely consumed by Harper. The memory of her standing beside him, the subtle tension that crackled between them, left him feeling as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into something unknown. Harper, too, felt the weight of their encounter. She returned to her office, closing the door behind her, and leaned against the wall for a moment, letting out a slow, shaky breath. Her chest felt tight, her heart racing with an intensity that surprised her. She had expected the meeting to clarify things, to ease the tension, but instead, it had only deepened it. The space between them felt more charged than ever, and she knew that this was just the beginning. As the day came to a close, both Harper and Luke found themselves reluctant to leave the office. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though something was building, something inevitable. They lingered at their desks, stealing glances at each other, each waiting for the other to make a move. But neither of them did. Not yet. The tension between them remained, unresolved but undeniable, as they both left the office, the quiet hum of the city filling the night air. Yet, as they walked away, each of them knew that the line between them had shifted. The connection they shared, once tentative and uncertain, had solidified into something tangible. And though neither of them knew where it would lead, they both understood that their lives had been irrevocably changed. Chapter 9. A Shared Silence. The morning sun filtered through the slatted blinds of Harper's office, casting long, parallel lines across the polished wood of her desk. She stood at the window, looking out at the city below, her mind adrift in the unspoken tension that had been growing between her and Luke. It had been days since their brief encounter, but it still clung to her like a shadow, its weight ever present. Harper tried to immerse herself in the familiar routine of work. Spreadsheets, emails, meetings, her usual refuge, but none of it felt the same. Every task felt like a surface she skimmed across, unable to sink into any of it fully. Her mind would wander, finding its way back to him. The quiet moments when he would catch her gaze across the office, the subtle brush of their hands as they exchanged documents, the way the air seemed heavier, more charged, whenever he was near. She had always prided herself on maintaining a strict professional distance with her employees. But Luke had somehow broken through that barrier. And it wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something more complex that neither of them had acknowledged out loud. But it was there, undeniable, in the space between them. Down the hall, Luke sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The glow of the monitor reflected off his face, but the words on it barely registered in his mind. His thoughts were miles away, wrapped around Harper and the silent pull that had grown stronger with each passing day. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Luke had tried to bury himself in work, to focus on learning the ropes and proving his worth in his new job, but none of it could distract him from the gravitational force pulling him toward her. He had felt it the moment they first met, that quiet energy between them that seemed to thrum just beneath the surface of their interactions. And now, it was like a current running through him, impossible to escape. The office hummed with the usual activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, muted conversations drifting through the air. But for Luke and Harper, it felt like the rest of the world had faded into the background. Every time Luke glanced toward Harper's office, he felt the pull growing stronger, an invisible thread binding them together, no matter how hard they tried to resist. As the hours passed, Harper found herself growing restless. She had finished her work for the day, but the feeling of unresolved tension gnawed at her. She stood up from her desk and began to pace the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stopped at the window again, staring out at the distant city skyline, her mind racing. Luke, too, felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had been productive, but his focus had wavered constantly. His gaze kept drifting toward Harper's office door, half expecting her to walk through it at any moment, half hoping she would. He had never been one to seek out confrontation or force anything, but the silence between them had grown too loud to ignore. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting the office in a warm, golden glow, Harper made a decision. She couldn't let this unspoken tension fester any longer. It wasn't in her nature to avoid difficult situations, and this was no exception. She needed to face it, whatever it was. Without hesitation, Harper left her office, walking with purpose toward Luke's desk. The open layout of the office made her approach visible, but she didn't care. Her heart raced, each step bringing her closer to whatever resolution lay ahead. Luke looked up just as Harper reached him. His pulse quickened, but he remained seated, watching as she placed a folder on his desk. The usual professional demeanor was in place, but Luke could feel the undercurrent of something more. She was there for more than just business. Harper pointed to a section of the document inside the folder, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. Luke nodded, his eyes scanning the contents, though his mind was elsewhere. He could feel the tension in the air between them, as thick as fog. They were standing inches apart, but the unspoken connection felt closer than ever. Harper stayed by his side for several moments, her presence lingering as Luke flipped through the pages. The task at hand was simple enough, a report that needed his review, but it wasn't about the report. It was about being near each other, about acknowledging that the silence they had shared all week wasn't something either of them could ignore. As the minutes passed, Harper's gaze drifted around the office, taking in the movement of their colleagues as they wrapped up their work for the day. But her attention kept returning to Luke, watching him as he methodically went over the report. There was something steady about him, something she found both calming and magnetic. It was a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud, and she realized that it was part of what had drawn her to him from the start. Luke finally set the report aside, glancing up at Harper. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There were no words exchanged, but the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Harper nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they both felt but hadn't yet addressed. She turned to leave, walking slowly back toward her office, her mind swirling with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. Luke watched her go, his heart still racing from the brief encounter. He knew they were at a tipping point, that something had shifted between them yet again. The tension, the pull, the quiet longing. It was all still there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would finally come to light. As the day wound down, the office slowly emptied, leaving Harper and Luke among the last to leave. Neither of them rushed, each taking their time to wrap up their final tasks. They moved through the motions of the workday, but their minds were somewhere else entirely. When Luke finally gathered his things to go, he paused for a moment, glancing back toward Harper's office. The light was still on, casting a warm glow through the frosted glass, but he didn't go to her. Not yet. There was something unspoken that hung in the air between them, and he knew it wasn't the right time to confront it. But he also knew that time was coming, sooner than either of them expected. Harper watched Luke leave from the corner of her eye, her heart heavy with the weight of their shared silence. The day had passed, but the connection between them had only grown stronger. She knew that whatever lay ahead, they were heading toward it together, whether they were ready or not. The city outside was quiet now, bathed in the fading light of the setting sun. As Harper closed her office door behind her, she felt the soft pull of anticipation tugging at the edges of her thoughts. There was no avoiding it now. Chapter 10. Unspoken Revelations. The city was bathed in a gentle twilight, the horizon a canvas of deepening hues as the sun set behind the skyscrapers. Harper walked slowly down the hallway toward her office, her thoughts heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. The encounter with Luke had left her restless, and she knew she needed to confront the growing tension between them. Entering her office, Harper turned on the desk lamp, the warm light casting a soft glow over the room. She sank into her chair, her gaze drifting to the framed photograph on her desk, an image of a serene beach at sunset. It was a reminder of simpler times, a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt now. The day had been filled with a quiet but palpable energy, each moment charged with the unspoken connection that had grown between her and Luke. Harper's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: curiosity, attraction, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. She had tried to bury herself in her work, to focus on the reports and spreadsheets that awaited her attention. But every glance toward Luke's desk, every brush of their hands during their brief interactions, pulled her further away from her professional facade. She began to sort through the papers on her desk, trying to focus on the task at hand. The quiet rustle of documents was the only sound in the room, a soothing counterpoint to the tumultuous thoughts racing through her mind. Her fingers traced the edges of the papers, moving methodically as she attempted to ground herself in the familiar routine. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Luke. In his apartment, Luke was experiencing a similar restlessness. The cozy, dimly lit space seemed to close in around him, the quiet punctuated only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. He sat on the edge of his bed, a notebook open in his lap. The pages were filled with scribbles and notes, half-formed ideas about his work and his observations of the office. But beneath the surface of his writing, there was a deeper, more personal struggle. He was trying to make sense of his feelings for Harper, but the words eluded him. The tension between them had become a constant undercurrent, shaping his every thought and action. Luke found himself replaying their interactions, searching for meaning in every glance, every unspoken exchange. It was as though his mind was a tangled web, with Harper at the center, pulling every thread into disarray. He closed the notebook and stood up, moving to the window to look out at the city lights. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of twinkling lights a stark contrast to the confusion that clouded his mind. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his thoughts, but the image of Harper's face, the warmth in her eyes, remained firmly entrenched in his mind. Back at the office, Harper leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the large window behind her desk. The cityscape was slowly darkening as the stars began to emerge, their distant glow a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond the confines of her office. She felt a sudden pang of longing, a desire to break free from the constraints of her professional life and explore the unknown. She stood up and walked to the window, her reflection blending with the view of the city below. The quiet of the evening was a stark contrast to the chaos of her thoughts. The office was empty now, the last of her colleagues having left for the day. The silence was both comforting and unsettling, a blank canvas on which her emotions seemed to be projected. As she stood there, her mind wandered back to the first time she had seen Luke. The moment was etched in her memory. The way he had looked at her, the subtle shift in the air as their paths had crossed. It was a fleeting encounter, but it had left an indelible mark on her heart. The following days had been a series of small, charged interactions, brief moments of shared silence, glances that lingered a little too long, and the undeniable pull that seemed to draw them closer together. Each encounter had added another layer to the tension, making it more complex and harder to ignore. Harper turned away from the window and walked to her desk, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the photograph. She thought about the implications of what was happening between them, the potential for both joy and heartache. The connection she felt with Luke was undeniable, but it also came with risks. Risks that could affect not only their personal lives but their professional ones as well. In the quiet of her office, she made a decision. She needed to address the tension head-on, to bring it out into the open and confront it. It was the only way to find clarity and to determine whether what she felt for Luke was something worth pursuing or merely a passing distraction. As the evening wore on, Harper's resolve solidified. She knew that whatever happened next, it had to be approached with honesty and courage. The weight of their unspoken connection had become too great to bear in silence. The time had come to face it, to explore what lay beneath the surface of their interactions and to determine the path forward. Meanwhile, Luke continued to wrestle with his thoughts, the city lights outside offering no answers to his questions. He knew that the days ahead would be filled with challenges and uncertainty, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. The connection he shared with Harper was something rare and precious, and he was determined to navigate the complexities of it with honesty and integrity. The night deepened, and both Harper and Luke found themselves grappling with their emotions, their thoughts intertwined with the quiet of the evening. They were on the brink of something new, something transformative, and the path ahead was both daunting and exhilarating. As Harper prepared to leave the office, she took one last look around, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. She knew that the next step would be crucial, that it would shape the future of her relationship with Luke and determine the course of their lives. Luke, too, felt the significance of the moment, his heart racing with anticipation as he prepared for the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead. The connection between them had reached a critical point, and both of them understood that the choices they made now would have far-reaching consequences. With the city lights shimmering below and the quiet night enveloping them, Harper and Luke stood on the precipice of change, their paths destined to intersect in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was one they were both ready to embrace, guided by the unspoken revelations that had brought them to this moment. Chapter 11. A New Understanding. The office was bathed in a serene morning light, the sun casting a warm glow through the large windows. Harper arrived early, the soft hum of the city outside creating a calming backdrop as she entered her workspace. The stillness of the office was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had occupied her mind over the past few days. Harper took a deep breath and moved to her desk, her movements deliberate and measured. The photo of the serene beach remained a quiet witness to her internal struggle. She had been grappling with the growing connection between herself and Luke, and the time had come to take decisive action. With practiced efficiency, Harper began to organize her workspace. The clutter of papers and reports from the previous days was neatly stacked and filed away. Her fingers moved methodically, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was preparing for a day that would be pivotal in shaping the future of her relationship with Luke. In the adjacent office, Luke arrived shortly after Harper, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor. The morning light filtered through the glass walls of the office building, casting intricate patterns across the floor. As he walked to his desk, his mind was occupied with the same questions that had plagued him for days. The connection he felt with Harper was undeniable, and he was determined to approach the situation with clarity and respect. Luke settled at his desk and began reviewing the tasks for the day. The routine of work provided a temporary distraction from his thoughts, but the undercurrent of anticipation remained. Every time he glanced toward Harper's office, he felt the pull of their unspoken connection. As the morning progressed, Harper and Luke went about their work with focused intensity. The usual hum of office activity surrounded them, but their attention was divided between their tasks and the unspoken tension that lingered between them. Harper took a break mid-morning and walked to the window of her office, her gaze drifting over the cityscape. The view was a tapestry of urban life, a reminder of the larger world beyond the confines of her workspace. The sun was high in the sky now, and the city seemed to pulse with energy and possibility. Luke, too, took a moment to step away from his desk. He wandered to the small kitchenette area of the office, making himself a cup of coffee. As he waited for the machine to brew, he glanced toward Harper's office. The sight of her standing by the window, her profile outlined against the light, stirred something deep within him. The quiet of the morning allowed Harper and Luke to reflect on the events of the past week. Their interactions had been brief but meaningful, and the connection they shared had grown more palpable with each passing day. The unspoken bond between them was both exhilarating and daunting, and it was clear that a resolution was necessary. In the early afternoon, Harper decided to take a walk outside. She left the office and stepped into the bustling city, her pace slow and contemplative. The streets were alive with people going about their daily routines, and the energy of the city seemed to mirror her own internal state, full of potential and possibility. Harper wandered through a nearby park, her footsteps light on the path as she took in the sights and sounds of the urban oasis. The greenery and open space provided a welcome contrast to the enclosed environment of the office. She found a quiet bench and sat down, allowing herself a moment of reflection. The park was filled with the gentle hum of nature, a bird's song, the rustling of leaves, and the distant laughter of children playing. Harper closed her eyes and let the tranquility wash over her. She thought about the growing connection with Luke and the impact it could have on her life. Meanwhile, Luke had also decided to take a break. He walked to a nearby cafe, a small, cozy spot that offered a respite from the busy office. He found a corner table and sat down, his coffee cup resting in front of him. The cafe was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As he sipped his drink, Luke's thoughts drifted to Harper. The moments they had shared, the silent exchanges, and the growing sense of intimacy were all consuming his thoughts. He wondered how to address the unspoken connection between them, and he hoped that today would bring some clarity. As the afternoon sun began to wane, Harper and Luke returned to their respective offices, both feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The time had come to address the tension that had been building between them, to bring their unspoken connection into the open. The office was quieter now, the usual hustle and bustle having subsided as the workday drew to a close. Harper and Luke exchanged glances across the open space, their eyes meeting with a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The weight of their unspoken feelings hung in the air, a tangible presence that neither of them could ignore. Harper took a deep breath and began to prepare for the evening ahead. She organized her desk and collected her belongings, her movements calm and deliberate. She knew that the next steps would be crucial in determining the future of her relationship with Luke. As the office gradually emptied, Luke finished his work and began to pack up. He took one last look around the workspace, his mind focused on the decision he needed to make. The connection he felt with Harper was undeniable, and he was ready to face the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead. The office was now quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of keys as employees finished their tasks. Harper and Luke stood on the brink of something new, their paths destined to intersect in ways they had yet to fully understand. As they prepared to leave, Harper and Luke exchanged a final, meaningful glance. The unspoken bond between them was stronger than ever, and both of them knew that the time had come to confront their feelings and to explore the possibilities of their connection. The city outside was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the lights twinkling like stars in the evening sky. Harper and Luke stepped into the night, each carrying the weight of their unspoken revelations and the promise of a new understanding. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they were both ready to embrace it with open hearts and minds, guided by the silent connection that had brought them to this moment. Chapter 12. The Unspoken Path. The office was cloaked in the tranquility of evening, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. Harper sat at her desk, the day's work completed, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the future. The office was empty now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of keyboards from the few late-working employees. She was alone with her thoughts, the silence both comforting and oppressive. The day's events had left her contemplative, her thoughts circling around the growing connection with Luke. The unspoken bond that had developed between them had reached a critical point, and she knew that the time had come to address it. The tension between them was palpable, and the path forward seemed both clear and uncertain. Harper gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate but distracted. She was preparing to leave for the night, but the weight of the decision she faced hung heavily on her mind. She took one last look around the office, her gaze resting on the large window that framed the city skyline. The view was a canvas of lights and shadows, a reflection of the choices that lay ahead. As she walked toward the exit, Harper's mind was occupied with the possibilities of what might come next. The connection she felt with Luke was undeniable, but it was also fraught with complications. She knew that confronting their feelings was necessary, but she also understood the risks involved. The path she was about to take was uncharted, and the future was uncertain. In the meantime, Luke was at home, his apartment a quiet sanctuary from the busy office. The evening light filtered through the window blinds, casting a warm glow over the room. Luke sat on the edge of his bed, his thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and trepidation. The events of the past few days had left him restless, and he found himself grappling with the same questions that had occupied Harper's mind. He glanced around his apartment, the familiar surroundings offering no solace from the inner turmoil he felt. The simple decor and muted colors of his living space seemed to mirror the calm exterior he had maintained. But beneath the surface, there was a storm of emotion. Luke knew that the time had come to confront his feelings and to take decisive action. The evening wore on, and Luke decided to take a walk to clear his mind. He stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The streets were relatively quiet, the hum of traffic and the occasional distant conversation the only sounds breaking the silence. As he walked, he allowed his thoughts to drift, his mind focused on the path he needed to take. Harper, too, found solace in the quiet of the evening. She decided to take a leisurely walk through the nearby park, the lush greenery and the soft glow of streetlights providing a calming backdrop. The park was a haven of tranquility, a stark contrast to the bustling city beyond its borders. Harper meandered along the winding paths, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The park was bathed in a gentle light, the moon casting a silvery sheen over the landscape. Harper found a secluded bench and sat down, her gaze fixed on the calm waters of a nearby pond. The ripples on the water reflected the moonlight, creating a shimmering pattern that seemed to dance in the gentle breeze. Harper took a deep breath, allowing the peace of the park to envelop her. As she sat there, she reflected on the connection she had with Luke. The moments they had shared, the silent exchanges and the lingering glances, had created a bond that was both beautiful and complex. Harper knew that confronting this bond was essential, but she also understood the challenges that lay ahead. Luke, too, was deep in thought as he walked through the city streets. The night air was crisp, and the cool breeze was a welcome relief from the warmth of his apartment. He found himself wandering aimlessly, his mind focused on the future and the choices he needed to make. The city lights cast a soft glow over the pavement, creating a mesmerizing pattern that seemed to mirror his own inner turmoil. As he walked, Luke's thoughts turned to the moments he had shared with Harper. Their interactions had been charged with unspoken emotion, and he felt a deep sense of connection with her. He knew that addressing this connection was crucial, but he also felt a sense of uncertainty about the outcome. The path forward was unclear, and he hoped that time would provide the answers he sought. The night deepened, and both Harper and Luke found themselves in a state of contemplation. The quiet of their respective surroundings provided a space for reflection, allowing them to process their feelings and consider their next steps. The unspoken bond between them was a powerful force, and both of them understood that it would shape their future. Harper eventually made her way back to her apartment, the calm of the park having provided her with a sense of clarity. She felt more resolute than before, ready to confront the tension that had been building between her and Luke. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was prepared to face it with courage and honesty. Luke returned to his apartment, his mind still occupied with thoughts of Harper. The walk had provided him with a sense of perspective, and he felt more determined to address their unspoken connection. The future was still unknown, but he was ready to embrace the possibilities it held. As the night wore on, both Harper and Luke prepared for the day ahead. They knew that the time had come to take decisive action, to confront the feelings that had been building between them. The unspoken path they were about to embark on was fraught with uncertainty, but it was a journey they were both prepared to undertake. The city continued to pulse with life, the lights twinkling in the darkness as a new day approached. Harper and Luke stood on the brink of change, their paths destined to intersect in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The journey ahead was both daunting and exhilarating, but they were ready to face it with open hearts and minds, guided by the silent connection that had brought them to this moment. Chapter 13. The Turning Point. The morning sun poured into the office, its rays cutting through the crisp autumn air and illuminating the sleek surfaces of Harper's workspace. The office, once bustling with the energy of a new workday, was now a quiet sanctuary. Harper sat at her desk, her focus unwavering as she sifted through reports and emails. The silence of the room was both soothing and intense, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her. Harper's gaze occasionally wandered to the large window behind her, where the cityscape was bathed in the golden light of dawn. The view was a mix of towering buildings and sprawling streets, a reflection of the dynamic world outside her office. It was a view she had come to appreciate for its calm and its ability to provide a momentary escape from the complexities of her personal life. Across the hall, Luke arrived at the office, his steps purposeful yet measured. The day had started with the promise of normalcy, but as he approached his desk, the weight of the previous evening's reflections seemed to linger. He greeted his colleagues with polite nods, his mind focused on the decision he needed to make. The morning was spent in a routine of meetings and tasks, but for both Harper and Luke, the usual flow of the day was overshadowed by the pressing need to address their growing connection. Each glance and every unspoken word carried a weight that neither could ignore, creating an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. Harper decided to take a break and stepped out into the common area of the office. The space was adorned with contemporary art and comfortable seating, designed to offer a respite from the work environment. She walked to the large window overlooking the city, her eyes following the movements of people below. The view was a reminder of the world beyond the office, a world that was both vast and intimately connected. In the quiet of her break, Harper allowed herself to reflect on her feelings for Luke. The connection between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and she felt a deep sense of urgency to address it. Her mind raced with thoughts of the possibilities and the potential outcomes. The silence of the office was both a refuge and a source of tension as she grappled with the decision that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Luke was engaged in his own moments of contemplation. He had taken a brief respite from his work and found himself in the small kitchenette area of the office. The coffee machine whirred softly as it brewed a fresh pot, and the aroma of coffee filled the air. Luke leaned against the counter, his thoughts drifting to Harper and the unspoken connection they shared. The quiet of the kitchenette was a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the office. Luke's mind was occupied with the same questions that had plagued him for days. The connection with Harper was undeniable, but the path forward remained uncertain. He knew that he needed to take action, but the exact nature of that action was still unclear. As the morning wore on, Harper and Luke continued with their work, each mindful of the growing tension between them. The office was a place of routine and structure, but beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of anticipation and longing. The shared glances and silent exchanges only heightened the sense of expectation that seemed to fill the space between them. In the early afternoon, Harper decided to take a walk outside. She stepped into the crisp autumn air, the cool breeze a refreshing change from the controlled environment of the office. The city was alive with activity, the streets bustling with people going about their daily routines. Harper walked with a sense of purpose, her mind focused on the decision she needed to make. The park she visited was a haven of tranquility amidst the urban landscape. The trees, their leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold, created a picturesque backdrop. Harper found a quiet bench and sat down, her gaze fixed on the gently swaying branches. The park was a peaceful escape, and she took a deep breath, allowing herself to relax. As Harper sat in the park, her thoughts were a mix of hope and apprehension. The connection she felt with Luke was undeniable, but it was also fraught with uncertainty. She knew that addressing their feelings was crucial, but she also understood the risks involved. The park provided a space for reflection, and she used the time to gather her thoughts and prepare for the conversation she knew was inevitable. Meanwhile, Luke had also decided to take a break from the office. He wandered through a nearby gallery, the serene environment providing a welcome distraction from his thoughts. The gallery was filled with contemporary art, each piece a reflection of creativity and emotion. Luke moved through the space, allowing himself to be immersed in the artwork. The gallery's quiet ambience offered him a moment of peace, a brief respite from the tension he felt. The afternoon passed slowly, with Harper and Luke each navigating their own moments of introspection. The park and the gallery had provided them with a temporary escape, but the underlying tension remained. They were both acutely aware of the need to address their feelings and the impact it could have on their lives. As the day drew to a close, Harper and Luke returned to the office, their minds still preoccupied with the unspoken connection between them. The office was now quieter, the end of the workday bringing a sense of calm. Harper and Luke exchanged brief, meaningful glances, their eyes reflecting the emotions they had been grappling with throughout the day. The office was bathed in the soft glow of evening light, the shadows lengthening as the sun set. Harper and Luke prepared to leave, each carrying the weight of their unspoken revelations. The path forward was still uncertain, but they were both ready to confront their feelings and to explore the possibilities of their connection. As they stepped into the evening, the city was alive with the vibrant energy of nightfall. Harper and Luke walked through the bustling streets, their paths crossing in the midst of the city's rhythm. The unspoken bond between them was a powerful force, and they knew that the time had come to address it. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but both Harper and Luke were prepared to face it with open hearts and minds. The turning point had arrived, and they were ready to embrace the future, guided by the silent connection that had brought them to this moment. Chapter 14. The Embrace of New Beginnings. The office was abuzz with the early morning activity, the familiar hum of conversation and the clacking of keyboards filling the air. Harper arrived early, her steps purposeful as she made her way through the bustling workspace. The day ahead was significant, and she could feel the weight of anticipation pressing upon her. The sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the office and signaling the start of a new chapter. Harper moved with a sense of calm determination, her gaze occasionally drifting to the empty chair across from her desk. The thought of her upcoming meeting with Luke was both exhilarating and daunting. She organized her papers and prepared her workspace, her mind focused on the importance of the day. Meanwhile, Luke arrived at the office, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the situation. The morning was crisp, and he carried a subtle air of resolve as he walked through the entrance. The office, now filled with the energy of a new day, seemed to pulse with the shared anticipation that had been building over the past weeks. Luke made his way to his desk, taking a moment to survey the office. His interactions with colleagues were polite but brief, his mind preoccupied with the impending meeting. The usual routine of the office continued around him, but Luke was focused solely on the task at hand. As the morning progressed, Harper and Luke went about their work, their glances and unspoken communication reflecting the underlying tension. The day's routine provided a backdrop to their silent exchange, each moment adding to the sense of expectation that hung in the air. The office was alive with activity, but for Harper and Luke, the day was marked by a deeper significance. At midday, Harper decided to take a moment for herself. She walked to the rooftop terrace, a secluded space offering a panoramic view of the city. The terrace was a quiet oasis amidst the bustling office, and Harper found solace in the fresh air and the expansive view. She stood at the edge, gazing out at the cityscape, her thoughts drifting to the forthcoming meeting with Luke. The city below was a mosaic of movement and color, a reflection of the dynamic world that Harper and Luke were about to navigate. Harper took a deep breath, allowing the serenity of the terrace to calm her nerves. The space was a temporary retreat, a place to gather her thoughts and prepare for the conversation that lay ahead. Luke, too, found a moment of respite. He stepped into the nearby cafe, the warm aroma of coffee and baked goods providing a comforting ambience. The cafe was a popular spot among office workers, its cozy interior a welcome break from the bustling environment outside. Luke ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, his thoughts focused on the meeting that awaited him. The cafe's quiet atmosphere offered Luke a chance to reflect. He sipped his coffee, his mind occupied with the significance of the upcoming discussion. The connection he felt with Harper was undeniable, and he was eager to address it, but the path forward remained uncertain. The cafe provided a brief escape from the tension, allowing Luke to center himself before returning to the office. As the afternoon wore on, both Harper and Luke prepared for their meeting. Harper returned to her desk, her focus unwavering as she organized her notes and reviewed the key points she wanted to address. She was determined to approach the conversation with clarity and honesty, ready to embrace whatever outcome awaited her. Luke, too, returned to the office, his steps resolute as he approached his desk. The day's activities had provided him with a sense of purpose, and he was prepared to face the conversation with Harper. The office was now quieter, the energy of the morning giving way to the calm of the afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for the late afternoon, and as the time approached, both Harper and Luke made their way to the conference room. The room was spacious and well lit, its modern design reflecting the company's forward-thinking ethos. Harper and Luke entered the room, their expressions reflecting a mixture of anticipation and determination. The conference room was prepared with refreshments and comfortable seating, but for Harper and Luke, the focus was on the upcoming conversation. They took their seats, the atmosphere charged with unspoken emotion. The room was a neutral space, a setting that would allow them to address their feelings and explore the path forward. As they settled into their seats, the quiet of the room seemed to amplify the weight of their unspoken connection. Harper and Luke exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting the depth of their feelings. The conversation that was about to unfold was significant, and they were both ready to face it with open hearts and minds. The meeting began, and the conversation between Harper and Luke unfolded with a sense of purpose. The exchange was marked by a deep understanding and a shared commitment to addressing their feelings. The connection between them was undeniable, and as they spoke, they navigated the complexities of their emotions with honesty and openness. The conversation was a turning point, a moment of clarity that allowed Harper and Luke to confront their feelings and explore the possibilities of their connection. The meeting provided a foundation for the future, a starting point for a journey that was both exhilarating and uncertain. As the meeting concluded, Harper and Luke left the conference room with a sense of resolution. The path forward was still evolving, but they had taken an important step toward understanding each other and building a shared future. The office, once a backdrop of tension and anticipation, now felt like a place of possibility and hope. The evening descended upon the city, casting a soft glow over the office. Harper and Luke prepared to leave, their hearts and minds focused on the new beginning that awaited them. The day had been marked by significant conversations and important decisions, and both were ready to embrace the future with optimism and courage. As they stepped out into the city, the night air was cool and refreshing. The bustling streets were filled with the vibrant energy of the evening, a reflection of the new possibilities that lay ahead. Harper and Luke walked through the city together, their unspoken connection guiding them toward a future of shared experiences and mutual understanding. The embrace of new beginnings was upon them, and they were ready to navigate the path with open hearts. The journey ahead was both exciting and uncertain, but Harper and Luke were prepared to face it together. The city, with its lights and energy, seemed to welcome them into this new chapter, offering a promise of hope and opportunity. The night was a canvas of possibilities, and as Harper and Luke walked side by side, they knew that they were embarking on a journey of discovery and growth. The unspoken bond that had brought them together was a source of strength, and they were ready to embrace the future with a sense of adventure and anticipation. Chapter 15. The Dawn of a New Journey. The city was draped in the quiet serenity of early morning, its streets bathed in the soft hues of dawn. The first light of day filtered through the windows of Harper's apartment, casting gentle shadows across the room. Harper lay in bed, her eyes closed, a peaceful expression on her face. The events of the previous days had set the stage for a new chapter in her life, and the promise of a fresh start was palpable in the crisp morning air. The apartment was a reflection of Harper's personality, modern and elegant, with a touch of warmth that made it feel like home. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the stylish furnishings and the carefully chosen artwork that adorned the walls. The tranquility of the space was a stark contrast to the bustling city outside, providing a serene environment for reflection. As Harper awoke, she stretched leisurely, allowing the peaceful start to the day to envelop her. The sense of calm was a welcome change, a moment of quiet before the day's activities began. She moved gracefully through her morning routine, the rituals of her day starting to fall into place with a newfound sense of purpose. In the midst of her routine, Harper paused by the window, gazing out at the city that was slowly coming to life. The buildings and streets below were gradually illuminated by the rising sun, the cityscape transforming into a vibrant tapestry of color and light. The view was a reminder of the world beyond her apartment, a world that was filled with opportunities and new beginnings. Meanwhile, Luke was also beginning his day. His apartment, though different in style, offered a similar sense of calm and order. He moved through his morning rituals with a deliberate grace, his thoughts focused on the day ahead. The light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the space. Luke's apartment was a reflection of his own character, simple yet sophisticated, with a touch of personal flair. The walls were adorned with mementos from his travels and experiences, each piece a testament to his journey through life. The morning light brought a sense of renewal, a fitting backdrop for the new chapter that was about to unfold. As the morning progressed, Harper prepared for the day with a sense of anticipation. She chose her attire with care, selecting an outfit that was both professional and reflective of her personal style. The process was a ritual of preparation, a way to align her external appearance with the inner sense of purpose she felt. Similarly, Luke prepared for his day, his movements characterized by a quiet confidence. He dressed thoughtfully, choosing an outfit that conveyed both professionalism and approachability. The preparation was a way to embrace the opportunities that awaited him, a reflection of his readiness for the new journey ahead. The city continued to awaken, its streets filling with the energy of a new day. Harper and Luke both left their respective homes, stepping out into the vibrant rhythm of the city. The transition from the tranquility of their apartments to the bustling environment of the city was a symbolic step, marking the beginning of their shared journey. Harper arrived at her office, her presence bringing a sense of calm determination to the workplace. The office, now familiar and welcoming, was a space where she could focus on the future and the new opportunities that awaited. She moved through the workspace with purpose, her actions reflecting the optimism and clarity she felt. Luke, too, arrived at his office, his demeanor reflecting a sense of readiness for the day's challenges. The office environment was a place of routine and structure, but for Luke, it was also a space where he could contribute to the company's success and embrace the possibilities of the future. The day unfolded with a sense of normalcy, but for Harper and Luke, it was marked by a deeper significance. The connection they had nurtured and the decisions they had made were now guiding their actions. Each task and interaction was infused with a sense of purpose, a reflection of the new journey they were embarking on. As the afternoon approached, Harper and Luke found themselves reflecting on the progress they had made. The connection between them had grown stronger, and their individual journeys were now intertwined. The day's activities provided a backdrop for their continued growth and exploration of their shared path. In the early evening, Harper and Luke crossed paths in the city, their interactions characterized by a sense of ease and familiarity. The encounters were brief but meaningful, a reflection of the growing bond between them. The city's energy continued to pulse around them, a vibrant reminder of the opportunities that lay ahead. As night fell, Harper and Luke both returned to their homes, the day's experiences settling into their thoughts. The cityscape, now illuminated by the lights of evening, provided a fitting backdrop for the end of the day. The transition from day to night was a metaphor for the journey they were on, a journey filled with promise and possibility. Harper and Luke spent their evenings in quiet reflection, their thoughts turning to the future and the new chapter they were beginning. The sense of anticipation and excitement was palpable, a reminder of the path they were forging together. The night provided a space for rest and rejuvenation, a necessary pause before the next day's activities. Harper and Luke both embraced the calm of the evening, their minds focused on the shared journey that lay ahead. As they drifted off to sleep, the city continued to buzz with life, its energy a reflection of the vibrant future that awaited. The dawn of a new journey was upon them, and Harper and Luke were ready to embrace it with open hearts and minds. The story of Harper and Luke had reached a pivotal moment, and their journey was just beginning. The city, with its lights and energy, seemed to welcome them into this new chapter, offering a promise of hope and opportunity. The future was filled with possibilities, and Harper and Luke were prepared to face it together, guided by their shared connection and the promise of new beginnings.